Welcome to the Weaving the Light Net TLDR, where we synthesize the week's news and wisdom from the web of planetary consciousness. You'll find threads of awakening, insight, and transformation woven into the tapestry of our shared journey through the cosmos. If you want to do deeper, check out the full-length episodes linked below.
You know, if you've been watching the news lately, it really feels like the world is just spinning out of control. We're seeing financial shocks, massive tech blackouts. This sense of chaos can be, well, a little overwhelming. But what if these events aren't nearly as random as they look? That's the big question we're tackling here. We're diving into a collection of sources that make a pretty bold claim that these are not isolated crises at all. They argue that when you start connecting the dots, a very clear pattern emerges. A pattern of a world in a massive transition, one that's reshaping everything from the ground up. Okay, so take what these sources describe happening in September of 2025. Afghanistan's entire fiber optic backbone was, they say, deliberately severed. And just like that, 40 million people were thrown into digital silence. Their connection to the rest of the world just gone in an instant. And right around that same time, a huge banking crisis apparently kicks off in Thailand. Now, the official story was a crackdown on fraud, but the result was that over 3 million bank accounts were frozen, with zero warning. We're talking about everyday people, families suddenly locked out of their own money. Meanwhile, back in the United States, something maybe even more personal was going on. The Department of Homeland Security was, according to these materials, quietly building a massive DNA surveillance program. Since 2020, they'd collected over 1.5 million genetic profiles. Okay, so let's really get into this. According to the sources we're looking at, these events aren't just random acts of chaos. They're described as carefully placed building blocks in what's called an emerging global architecture of control. And a huge piece of this architecture, as they present it, is the idea of a digital ID. Now, officially, it's sold to us with all these promises, right? Convenience, security, fighting crime. But these sources, they interpret it very differently. They argue that digital ID is really just a friendlier, more marketable term for a system that could one day act as a gatekeeper for our right to buy and sell, and could even lead to a social credit score. And what's so fascinating here is how this web connects totally different parts of our lives. You've got financial control, like what the bank freezes in Thailand, communications control, like the internet blackout in Afghanistan. The sources also point to technological control, with big companies complying with state censorship. And then there's the biological layer with these huge DNA databases. It's all presented as one single integrated system. And the sheer scale of that biological part is, well, it's staggering. 1.5 million genetic profiles collected by just one U.S. department since 2020. I mean, think about that. These sources describe our own genetic blueprint as the deepest, most fundamental layer of this control grid. And this really gets to the heart of the warning in this material. The idea is that infrastructure built for one specific purpose, say immigration enforcement, almost never stays confined to that purpose. Once the system is built, it's just too easy for its scope to expand into something much, much bigger. So when you look at the timeline from 2020 to 2025, these sources don't see a series of unfortunate accidents. They frame this entire period as a deliberate Great Reset, a time they claim when crisis was literally used to fast-track a whole new social and technological order while sidelining political opposition and making these new surveillance systems feel, well, normal. So, okay, if that's the what, this whole architecture of control, the sources also offer a much deeper why. And it's not just about politics or money. They argue that to really get what's happening, you have to look at all this turmoil in a different light, in spiritual terms even. They bring up this concept called a collective dark night of the soul. Now, you might have heard this term used for an individual going through a tough time, but here it's being applied to all of humanity. The thinking is that all the chaos and fear and division we're seeing, it isn't a sign that we're falling apart. It's our collective shadow coming to the surface, something that has to be seen and faced head-on before any real healing can actually start. And this slide really illustrates the choice that these articles present. They see humanity as splitting onto two different parallel paths or timelines. One timeline is based on fear, manipulation, and control by what the sources call the deep state, these powerful, unelected groups. But the other timeline, that one's about awakening, about tapping into a divine purpose and actually embracing this massive global shift. So given that choice, the articles don't just leave you with the problem. They actually lay out a whole blueprint, a toolkit for how to navigate this transition and consciously choose that path of light and personal sovereignty. And they stress that this entire journey, it has to start from within. It's about practical steps for what they call spiritual and physical hygiene. Things like clearing your body through detox so you can think more clearly, tuning your mind with breathwork like Sudarshan Kriya Yoga to become more resilient to fear, awakening your intuition, and learning how to create the life you want from a place of authenticity, not from your ego. And then beyond all the inner work, they get really practical about real-world preparation. To counter a digital financial system that they see as fragile, they suggest holding tangible assets like physical gold and silver. To push back against top-down control, they say to strengthen your local community bonds. And to build a better future, invest your time and energy in things that solve real-world problems: food, water, and energy. This brings us to a really crucial warning they make. Be careful about placing your hope in external saviors. Whether it's a political figure who promises they have the plan or some miraculous new medbed technology that's going to fix everything, the argument is that this is all a distraction. True power, true sovereignty, they insist, has to be built from the inside out. So in the end, the entire worldview presented in these sources really just boils down to this one fundamental question. It's a choice between a future that's defined by external control and one that's defined by the expansion of our own internal consciousness. And the final point they make is that this choice, well, it's being made by every single one of us, right here, right now.
You've been listening to the Weaving the LightNet TLDR. To explore more about any of these topics, visit lightnet.co.uk or listen to the full deep dive podcast episode linked below. Give the video a like, share this episode with others who would appreciate it, and subscribe to join us next week as we continue weaving the web of planetary consciousness together. Stay sovereign.